Hello, and welcome to the first edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle meeting for 2018. Today is January 2nd. I was hoping to start off the year going through our mission statement, which Justin and Barbara was kind enough to write a draft of last year. And I think that will help us focus, as I think Lucas has later in the agenda, that we should also talk about like what's our roadmap for 2018 and where are we headed, if we kind of have an agreement on what our overall goals are as a SIG. So if people want to pull that up, it's linked at the top of today's meeting notes. I think this part of this mission statement, Lucas and I also presented at KubeCon. Hopefully it's not too controversial. I think some of the details might be controversial, but hopefully the overall points aren't. It starts out saying, SIG Cluster Lifecycle examines how we should change Kubernetes to make it easier to operate. That's sort of the one-line blurb of what we think we're doing, which I think Justin put pretty well into text. He also wrote that compared to SIG Cluster Ops, which is focused on how to operate today's version of Kubernetes. And if you look at what Rob is trying to do with SIG Cluster Ops, it's really trying to gather operators and talk about best practices of what they are doing, like Justin said, with what we have today, whereas SIG Cluster Lifecycle is looking at how do we make it better, and in particular, how do we write code, how do we change the core, how do we write tools to make it easier to operate. So thoughts, comments, suggestions on that as a one-line blurb?
I was thinking manage and operate, because you could say operate is managing, but just more explicit, whatever's.
Do you have permission? Do you have permission to type, or do I have to type that?
Everything shows up as suggestions, so it's probably easier if you type, Justin.
Okay. Or I'm.
Chris? No? You're sort of mumbling there. All right. If people generally tend to agree on that, and again, please feel free to go back and add comments or suggestions to the doc after the fact. But Justin sort of broke that down into 4 primary areas. And I think this is where we're going to maybe start to have a little bit more discussion. The first one is control plane configuration management. So how do we configure different parts of the Kubernetes control plane? So how do we pass flags to the API server, the controller manager, et cetera. And in particular, we do that with flags today, but we prefer not to be using flags in the future. And so as a SIG, we have been driving the component configuration effort. Thoughts, suggestions on that section? Okay, I'm going to keep moving since we have lots of other agenda topics. Next is add-on management. This is basically, we have the core, which is pretty generally agreed upon what that is. Pretty much all Kubernetes installations install the API server, the controller manager, the scheduler. But there are other things that aren't part of that control plane that people want to install. So, on GCE, we wrote this terrible shell script to manage what we called add-ons, which is still alive. Kops has channels. Other systems have sort of done their own thing, and kubeadm, just kubectl apply -fs, kubeproxy, and you can apply your network CNI implementation as well. And those are sort of additional parts of your cluster that are sort of needed that for sort of the cluster itself to function as opposed for applications to function. A while back, we had a discussion when Brian was on the call about how add-on management was part of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. So I don't think it's going to be too contentious that we own add-on management. I think what's maybe more contentious that came out of the meeting before KubeCon was exactly what add-ons are and what it means to manage them. So I think while it's pretty clear that's part of our mission, it's not clear what we should be doing with that part of our mission. All right, next is infrastructure management. So this is how do I actually provision machines and set up a network? So this is something that sort of to date, as we've been focusing on kubeadm, we've sort of put out of scope, right? So kubeadm was explicitly not trying to do infrastructure management. But we have the wider ecosystem with folks that are writing kops and kubespray people that work on GKE or AKE. And with the cluster API, we're sort of pushing more into this part of how to manage clusters. So I would argue this isn't really contentious in the sense that we should have sort of had this on our mission from the beginning. We just haven't been focused a lot on actually achieving this mission to date. So next is etcd management. So this is, how do I run etcd? And I think this is maybe a little bit more contentious because there's a lot of overlap between the SIG API machinery and us in this case. We're interested in etcd because it's part of standing up a cluster. It's part of the life cycle of upgrading a cluster. When do you upgrade up etcd? How do you deal with the storage versions? But on the other hand, etcd in some ways is an implementation detail of the API server as its data store. And the entire system is built around talking to the API server and not talking to etcd. And no one should actually care whether we run etcd or maybe we replace it with Zookeeper or something else in the future. Everything should continue working because it's really just a data store for the API server. So this one I think is a little less clear to me. Go ahead.
I was going to say, etcd is an implementation detail. So for a user case, I think they shouldn't care. But an operator case, they absolutely must, for the reason you said. Backing up etcd is not only the hardest, but it's the most important part of managing a Kubernetes cluster, I think, unless you use something like the operator to reduce that management cost. I
would argue it's not the hardest part of operating a cluster. It's actually not that hard to back up etcd, as opposed to upgrading Kubernetes itself. But I do agree it's one of those important parts because your cluster isn't really resilient if you're not backing up etcd.
Fair enough. I just think that, and these aren't even etcd management problems per se, but backing up etcd is not sufficient to restore a Kubernetes cluster, right? There are a bunch of application-specific deployment details that you have to understand. In the case of etcd failure, you do lose some data. The question is understanding what that data is and whether you care.
As far as wording in the doc goes, I fail to see why this isn't a detail underneath the control plane management, because we were calling it out explicitly, but it is basically just part of the control plane.
I think the distinction, at least from my point of view, is that I think we have a clear idea of how, it might be that we do that, right? In an ideal world, great. I think we have a clear idea of how to manage the control plane through Kubernetes with the component config effort. I think we have less of an idea about how to do etcd management or how we should run etcd, even if we had component config working today, right? We have the etcd operator, but it maybe isn't the right way. We're not sure. There are other alternatives. I have a little Christmas hack I'd love to show at some stage. There are things that was the distinction in my mind, and it might be that we end up collapsing them, but it's definitely a less clear path.
So Tim, you sort of alluded to the last thing here. So the first one we mentioned was configuration of the control plane. And the last one is actually managing the control plane software, which is actually, what do we run on a machine? So if you bring up a new machine that should be a master or a control plane node, what actually runs there? And so one question is, should etcd run there, right? That's one way to configure Kubernetes, but you can also point to external etcd that's run on a separate set of machines. And maybe that's another place where we can't be too opinionated because everybody's going to have, especially people who are running their own clusters, are going to have a way that they want to run it. And where maybe etcd is sort of treated as more of a special snowflake than the rest of Kubernetes control plane. I think that might be sort of why Justin called it out, is because it's sort of a different snowflake and it has to be treated a little bit differently. Okay.
I think most of the topic areas under our purview as far as goals are pretty non-contentious. I think the one comment that was in the chat channel was possibly having non-goals listed underneath add-on management, such that we don't, we know we're bounded in scope there, just so it's explicit.
Do you have suggestions for what those non-goals should be? I mean, I think atom management is tricky because, as I said, like there's not really consensus on what that even means at this point. And so it's not clear to me we know what it doesn't mean either. And maybe it's easier to say what it doesn't mean because there's some things that are clearly out of scope. But I'm not sure, since we don't know what's in scope, exactly how to bound that. And maybe we should just make that clear as part of saying, you know, we're on the hook for atom management and we don't really know what that means yet. And one of our goals for this year is to figure out what that means.
We have to define it.
Yeah, sort of to flush out that part of the mission.
Yeah, but we definitely don't want to build something for deploying like end user applications with complicated templating, right? It might be that what we build happens to serve the purpose for basic applications, but it's not our goal to build something for the generic, like, you know, replacement of CI/CD system. That is totally out of what we're aiming for, right? We're trying to do the bare minimum to get us to the system, get the system up and running enough that you can bring up whatever you want. But I don't know how to draw the line.
Okay, so given that this has been pretty uncontentious, I would propose that we turn this into a pull request to put somewhere that's a little bit more visible than a Google Doc, where we can point people at it. And it can be found via search. Because I think this Google Doc is pretty hidden, and unless someone is attending this meeting or reading our meeting notes, they're never going to stumble across it or understand what our SIG does. And then we should link it from the community directory that describes our SIG. Maybe we should just stick it in that community repository for now until we have a SIG-specific repository. Justin, can you take that?
Yes, so we're peering to the community repo. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the right place to store it, at least for now.
So we can get our own repo if we want to over time, but one of the things that, as part of Contribx, that I think we're going to end up doing is turning the community repo into a site that is a peer site to Kates.io, something like community.kates.io. And so there'll be sort of pretty rendering and easier ways to find it and all that stuff if you keep it in the community repo.
And that seems like a great place for our mission statement to end up anyway, once that's nicely rendered. Okay. So that sounds like probably the permanent home at that point. Cool. So Walter was next to talk about cloud provider working group overview, but I'm not sure if he's here, so I might have to punt that. Okay, we'll put that towards the bottom of the list. And it looks like Lucas showed up. So Lucas, you want to start going through the next set of things you've got?
Yeah, I talked to Walter like 2 weeks ago or something, and he might come and join later. Basically saying what the cloud provider working group is doing and what the next steps are. Yeah, so the first thing I had was basically like the wiki content that we had is really out of date, as you can see from the link. Well, should we just delete it, or is there any? I mean, it has been checked in once now, but it's definitely obsolete. Anyone up for like making that reflect the current state, or do we just delete it as it may be harmful, or should we show history? Whatever. What do you think?
So the interesting doc there is the roadmap, right? The roadmap for cluster deployment.
Yeah. Roadmap cluster deployment.
Yeah, I feel like it would be useful for us to actually have a roadmap. I know you sent out like a doc for 2018 roadmap, and that should probably be in context of where we're going in general. And again, I think putting that in the community repo is sort of the right place to put it. So like under our SIG directory in the community repo.
Yeah, so this is right now on the SIG class lifecycle / migrated from wiki. roadmap cluster deployment, and it's basically the same place we'd put our like mission statement as well. And if we want, and think my 2018 roadmap somewhat describes the current state of the world, we could just check that in, convert it from the Google Doc, and replace that one with our 2018 goals instead of this one.
Yeah, I didn't realize it had already been migrated. Sorry, I was thinking this was just deleted from the wiki. Let me take a quick pass over it, because I think a lot of stuff here should just be deleted and replaced with your roadmap, but there might be a couple things that we're saving.
Cool. Yeah, just something I happened to notice. Okay, so the next thing is, yeah, we should expand our GitHub team. Right now, we don't have many people there. I just wrote down a couple of names. If you feel that you want to be in these GitHub teams, which basically means if we at Kubernetes/SIG Lifecycle and one team, which can be bugs, feature requests, PR reviews, whatever, you should go to the, I think I had a URL there. No, I don't. Anyway, you can, if you are in the org, you can go to teams inside of the Kubernetes org, search for SIG Lifecycle, and request to join. We'd love to see more people there. I think it's Robert that is managing the organization right now.
I think we're going to have to be mindful too that some of these, eventually, if you want to get on the owner's files, that means certain obligations too, right? Like this is basically a notification mechanism, so be aware of what you're getting yourself into. You will be spammed heavily, so you will not have to set up filters and whatnot. I have like an array of filters along with only setting myself up to certain groups are the notification ones, and I willfully get myself off of the other groups, right? So as long as people know what they're getting into, that also helps too.
Yeah, along the same lines, I'd say that we should make it a prerequisite before adding people as owners that they be added to these groups, right? Like you shouldn't be in the owners files if you're not being notified of issues and bug requests and so forth.
Yeah, that is basically a thing I noticed. So, I mean, Fabrizio, Peter, Alexander, and Jamie, at least, would be nice to get there. Ilya probably as well. From what I understand, he's going to help out this quarter and maybe the next ones as well. Lee, Sergey, Ryan, if you want. I mean, I find these useful, but as Tim said, if you are on too many teams, it's definitely a, well, game to play with filters.
Yeah, I mean, I can also force add people to the groups too. Like if there are people you think should be in the groups,
okay,
you just add them. And if other people want to join, there's the opt-in process. So if there are people in the owners files, I think we should just go ahead and add them to all the groups and tell them we're sorry about the extra email. And then they can take themselves out of the groups too. I think, right?
Yeah, I think the 4 first ones are in the owners file. So please add them. And the other 4 are opt-in.
Okay, I'll take an AI to do that for the first 4. Oh, good. Joe's here for the next one. So the next one is this issue that I opened in 2015 about hyperkube after Joe had started working on it. And I think Lucas is asking, do we still care? Because the issue has not been touched for quite a while.
It seems like a lot of folks still do use hyperkube. I think, is it something that we want to sign up to support? I think is the larger question. Or should we kill it? I think if we killed it, it would definitely make things harder for folks. But I figure we have to go one way or the other. I'm not sure who else would sign up to own the thing.
So yeah, I mean, it's basically this. Yeah, I mean, this is basically what Minikube has to some extent. Have you ever heard of local cube?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is the mega binary that runs all the server components, all the stuff inside of Minikube as one process.
Okay, so I think there's
it's totally different from hyperkube. So this all-in-one thing, or that's right. So this all-in-one thing that Robert. Okay, well, we have two different things. So one thing is that we run all server processes inside of the same process at the same time. I don't think we want to do that. That is what Minikube is doing now, until this release or something where they switch to kubeadm. So, and they basically want to kill that. But on the hyperkube side, we have a lot more to discuss. Tim?
So we actually, you did a while ago the comparison of wanting to use hyperkube for kubeadm, and we actually backed away from it because of the two major reasons that I recall. Feel free to amend other bits, but the first one was the init fuddling, which does, there's so many inits that if you strace it, it's kind of crazy. The second one was the binary bloat, in that it was like hundreds of megabytes smaller when we did the separate binaries versus the thunk.
Really? That's
Yep.
confusing.
It is confusing, but it was. I'd have to dig up the issue.
I think so. One issue is that we started throwing everything into hyperkube, including the kubelet and kubectl. So, like, it really took on a whole bunch of stuff. I think if we remove the kubelet, if we remove kubectl, because one of the other things is that when we have the kubelet in there and then we build a Docker image around it, that Docker image has to bring in all the dependencies that the kubelet needs to run when it's Dockerized, which is a lot, right? Whereas if we just do the sort of the main control plane components, I think it gets a lot smaller. It's quicker to build and it's easier to distribute when you're talking about distributing stuff. So maybe the right thing to do is to pare it down a little bit. I do know that if we decided to kill hyperkube, I'm sure that there would be people who would be upset because it would ruin their flow. I know that there are folks using it. So that would definitely be something that we'd want to think about very carefully.
Yeah, I mean, the init thing is real. I mean, all the all the Go depths that Kubernetes has, some of them have a lot of nasty stuff that when you add every single package in Kubernetes into the same binary, we have even hit some like Golang limits in earlier versions, not recent ones. But yeah, the main benefit, as you said, is like local development or whatever, that we can have the same image that we could distribute to all places. But still, I mean,
as a point of order, do we want to, because I don't know, because we're not planning on supporting this for kubeadm deploys, right? Is that fair to say?
kubeadm, no, like kubeadm doesn't, if you override the image to use, then you can point it at whatever, but not.
Well, I know at one point, Lucas, your sort of development flow involved the hyperkube image, right?
The beginning.
Do you still do that when you're developing?
No. It was before a time. Well, it was at a time when Kubernetes was small enough to be able to handle the thing. So
Could we mark this as a help wanted and leave the flag to leave it open for the time being? Because I don't think it's going to be prioritized in the near term unless we have a use case that makes a lot of sense. But we can always just mark the flag to leave the issue open and leave it as help wanted. So people who are new to the space who wanted to start to spin up into it, this could be one of those helper tasks where folks want to spin into the SIG cluster lifecycle and want to get their feet wet in understanding all the components and configuration. They could dive into some aspects of this.
Yeah. So on this specific issue number that I linked, can we mark that closed at least, which is like integrated CD and flannel into hyperkube?
Yes, let's not do that.
Yeah. And then just keep the finish hyperkube transition, I think it's called, the link issue there.
Yeah.
That Joe, I think, has.
And I think there is some sort of like plan sketched out that's not insane in that issue, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. I mean, at some point, people, if I remember correctly, people were even talking about like, oh, should we like deprecate all the individual binaries and just go with one mega binary? There was some discussions like in Kubernetes 2 that would have one binary executed for all the server components. I don't think we're necessarily planning to do that anymore. But there was some good ideas as well floating around. Yeah. Robert closed the etcd thing and we'll keep the transition thing open. Okay. It was just things that like I've had in my notification list for years, and now that I dug up all the stuff, I happened to find this. Yeah, reprioritize this issue that Ilya brought up a long time ago. Basically, there's, as I wrote in my 2018 goals or roadmap as proposed ones, I'd like us to require that the getting started guides in the docs should be marked conform, like should have posted their conformance thresholds to CNCF/K8s conformance. I think that's a sane requirement, that you can prove that this is conformant, this is upgradable, and maybe some third or fourth requirement as well. And by doing that, we can actively reduce the number of getting started guides we have, and also the number of getting started guides we reference. Right now, we reference, like, it's just if you send a PR to reference your whatever solution, you might be lucky enough to have a docs maintainer merge that for you, and then your reference there. I think that would be some benefits in having some kind of rules that these N distributions are certified in this repo. They have actively, like, they have signed with CNCF to make sure they're certified for some time as well in the future. Things like that.
I think that's a good way to axe a lot of the ones that are there today and say, like, now that we have a certification process and lots of people are certified, we can use that to go through and delete a whole bunch of old ones. I'm not sure that that's going to be a high enough bar going forward, though. Like, I think for the core repo, we may not want to say anyone who's certified can add a whole bunch of documentation to the Kubernetes website. I think that's a good way to get rid of old stuff right now.
So yeah, I mean, I was mostly thinking about deleting stuff. basically, if you have a community thing, like a community distribution, as CNCF calls it, I think it's reasonable to have your docs in the this Kubernetes website repo, like kubeadm, like kops, maybe kubespray, projects like that. But if you're a vendor that has a product, you may get referenced if you are conformant, but not like all your docs into that place. But if we have this requirement, it would be easy to remove a lot of different. I mean, I've tried to do this sometimes, like using Git to find out who's touched this in 2 years ago, and then ping them and say, could you remove this? And they say, no, it could be useful still.
I like the negative test. I think that's a good idea. If it's not conformant and they haven't updated and put the effort in, I think that we should start trimming. We've got a lot of cruft. We got to maintain it over time. Actually leads people down the wrong path, right?
It does.
So I think that it makes perfect sense to, in my mind, to have it as a base level requirement for removal, as Robert said earlier.
As a sanity check, are things like kops and kubespray that we know are active projects on the conformance list, or are the conformance lists mostly vendor-based solutions?
They're vendor-based, but I think there are community-based ones being added too.
Yes, kops passes the tests, and I found out the rules, and there are, if you're a vendor, you have to like join the CNCF, but if you're open source community-based, there is a path to getting on there, so it's not a barrier for it shouldn't be a barrier for anyone, I think.
Okay, but it sounds like kops isn't on the list today, so we might want to hold off 2 weeks and give kops and kubespray sort of a heads up saying, this is the plan, we're going to rip all this stuff out that doesn't have the certification label. Let's, since those projects should already be passing all of the tests, it's more of a process of getting the documentation in place so that we don't sort of bite off our nose to spite our face as we're trying to clean stuff up here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should probably just give everyone fair notice, and if you want to give kops fair notice to get off it's my butt, and then I will do that.
Yeah, I was thinking let's do the announcement now. Like we could say we could start easy with just the conformance thing. We could add you should have docs to upgrade as well, or whatever. But just start with the conformance thing. You should be on that list, and if you are not, you will be removed right after 110 is released, and then you won't get into 111 docs. I think that's a fair time frame because it gives the maintainers 3 months of notice. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a generous time frame. I agree.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, thanks, Robert, for writing that down for me.
Do we have an owner for actually notifying people who own these pages? Do you have time to do that, Lucas? Or do we need to find someone to do that?
I think Ilya could do it. Last time I synced with him, but I'll check with him and see. If he can't do it, I'll find someone else.
Okay, I'll write down Lucas will find an owner.
Yep. And yeah, right now we have 57 PRs up that mention kubeadm in some way. It's just, I mean, now that I won't be actively trashing this list, it will tend to grow. So
again, like I mentioned earlier, my plan for this cycle is not to actively take on hurtful tasks, but to facilitate other tasks that people are executing on. So I plan to help manage, sort, review that list over this cycle, just so we can keep on trucking. And also would welcome any help for folks that want to help be facilitating or help facilitate this group, because it is a non-trivial level of work, right? Just to prio sort the backlog is kind of bananas, right? So
yeah, I mean, dev stats is kind of interesting as well. I was looking at the number of reviews reviews made, and I mean, it's a lot of just for kubeadm, just for this repository, it's a lot of reviews that are made every cycle. So it's a lot of work, and I really appreciate that you're committing to help out with that. Cool. TLS bootstrapping. Do we think we could just slap the GA label on this?
Who is the primary SIG driving this? Is it us? Is it SIG auth, or is it SIG node?
SIG auth and us.
I think it's mostly us because we did it for kubeadm, and SIG auth is grudgingly signing off on stuff. I think it's done. I don't know. Moyer, what do you think, man? Are you?
Yeah, I don't know of any pending items, but I can bring it up at SIG auth. I think SIG auth probably is the best owner.
Yeah, so last call from SIG auth. If they have no concerns, so just call it done.
Okay. And Matt, you can take the action to do that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Moore.
Yep, and I've written up, as we discussed, kubeadm to GA doc and a 2018 roadmap. Well, basically, just extracted what I had in the 2018 roadmap into a separate doc as requested, so it's easier to share with others. It's a draft. Both are drafts, so please do go ahead and edit them. I'm not going to have time to actively add a lot of stuff there or refactor or whatever. So this is in the hands of the SIG collectively. So don't be afraid to change things there. And on a similar note, we should decide whether we're doing a 110 planning doc as well, as we've done for like 4 releases now in the Google Doc format, or if we go all in on caps.
I'd love to see us go all in on caps, but I don't see it being realistic. It's been a month or so since we made our first one, and we've got maybe one more. I think we should sketch out a quick doc because it'll be quicker and easier to review, and then maybe try to turn those into caps and use the caps going forward from there. I mean, we're already partway through the 110 release cycle, right? And so I think we should just do that next week.
Cool. Robert, could you take that as an action item, or
yeah,
do you have
I'll create the outline of that doc based on the old doc with the same people, and we can go through and edit it next week.
Cool.
Does anyone have the proposed dates thus far, just for edification of everybody else here? Because I've been out of it for a while, and so has everyone else. I have no idea what the dates are for feature freeze and for getting all the stuff in line. It's always earlier than everything else. So
yes, I'll pick it up in a minute. Yeah, Jace has a proposed. Where can we find it? Yeah, there we go. You should now see it in the meeting notes. And the dates are code-free. The release cycle begins today, it says here. It ends on release day, which should be Wednesday, March 21st. Feature freeze is January, the 2nd of January, which is in 3 weeks, we should have a clear sense of the caps we want to have, the features that are there, and create the features issues for those caps, or whatever we call them, tracking items. Code freeze, which is one of the most important dates, is February 26th, and docs must be completed and reviewed by March 9th. So we have about 55 days or so before the code freeze. And yeah, 3 weeks before all features should be in.
I know that we had bantered about it, but no one had actually, maybe I should take this to the community meeting. And I know, Robert, you had mentioned it earlier too, was whether or not 4 releases per year still made sense to go at this cadence versus something like 3. Has there been any communication on any of that at all? Because sometimes our dev cycles, like the last release, was totally compressed with having the 4 per year.
Yeah, that was something that I wanted to talk about at the contributor summit that did not make the cut. So I'm not sure if that means other people weren't interested in that topic, or people thought things were working well the way they were.
I think I'll try poking the hornet nest on the community meeting, because the last develop cycle was kind of, I don't know, the overhead to productive useful code ratio was really high. So I think 3 per year makes a lot of sense to me, but it's a community type of thing, not a, my Tim's opinion or Robert's opinion or anything. So
yeah, on this note, Tim had a very interesting talk. Tim Hockin, had a very interesting talk at KubeCon on kernels vs distros. I could link it here as well, which basically says that we should release faster and slower at the same time by separating the code, like the kernel, like the Linux kernel from the Ubuntu release schedule. They should not be the same. And right now, they are kind of the same. Imagine Ubuntu releasing every 3 months. Or every 12 weeks. So yeah, I could see if I find that talk.
But again, like Tim was saying, that's one person's opinion, a different Tim in this case. And there's not necessarily community consensus or anyone sort of changing processes in response to that talk at this point. Right? We're still kind of cranking the wheel as we did last year, without looking back and making sure that's the right way to be cranking the wheel.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's, definitely just one opinion or idea. And for what it's worth, I don't think he had that many action items or tasks to execute on in the talk. So we'd still, as a community, have to figure out some way. And it might be that we just consider this for Kubernetes 2 or whatever, and whatever that's going to look like. I don't know.
I have opinions on this conversation, but I think we should probably table it for, I don't know whether or not SIG architecture makes this call, or I don't know where's the landing location. I'll start the conversation in community and see if it has a landing home for somewhere.
Probably SIG architecture, office hours, and the weekly meetings, maybe some community polls, then the steering committee, or it's gonna basically touch everyone if we try to do something about it, or if anyone tries to do something about it.
All right, we've got 10 more minutes. Let's move to the next one. This looks like sort of a furthering of the conversation that Tim was mentioning earlier about Tim taking over as the sort of overhead manager, if you will, dealing with issue backlog and so forth. I don't know if there's anything in particular from these links that we want to call out to the larger group, or if we just want to let Tim triage and pull things up that he thinks are important to visualize here.
Yeah, I basically wrote this before I started thinking about it. I should write it down in an issue, and now I've got the issue with some starting PRs to look at, and the contributors I mentioned have already created. They have already done their job and created the cherry pick PRs and everything, so should be fine.
Okay, so next, Lucas has started a doc on how to contribute to the SIG. Again, we should definitely turn this into a PR once it's flushed out. Right now, it looks like there's a nice flushed out section about kubeadm. There's a skeleton for a section about the cluster API. We should add a section for kops or kubespray or any other sort of SIG related projects that we want to advertise. And as those get, we can PR them sort of one at a time as each section is ready. I think it would be nice to have one place where you say, like, here's a description of our SIG, here's our mission statement, here's how to help, right? And sort of put that stuff all together. So just like with the mission statement that Justin's going to turn into a PR, please take a look at the doc, because I think we'll start turning sections of this doc into PRs as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically, I started from a document I had in the kubeadm repo, but as discussed, it makes more sense to have a more general contributing to the SIG versus this is what kubeadm's release cycle looks like. There's a small but important difference there, and this should be more general and alongside all the other SIG-related documents, not something that is living in the kubeadm repo and nobody ever notices. So yeah, Justin or Chris maybe could add something about kops there, and others, yeah. So we could have, and also we could maybe even find some consistency, like when we see what we're doing, and some common processes. I don't know.
Cool. Thanks for starting that out, Lucas. Next, Fabrizio has an email they sent out over the break, which I haven't actually read yet, and a link to a doc and some ASCII cinema about kubeadm HA, I believe. Fabrizio, do you want to give us some more details?
Yes, last week I played a little bit about the idea of implementing the kubeadmin join masters, and I wrap up a first prototype that works quite well, and the video show how it looks like, and in the document there is the current limitation of the prototype. If you have time to take a look at it, we can then consider if make this part of the 110 cycle or not.
So from what I saw, the really brief, just look briefly at it, it seems like the current version that you have there is more a syntactic sugar on top of, like, instead of running kubeadm in it, you'd run this join dasher master, but it would do essentially the same, and you still have to invoke the manual steps like creating the load balancer, copying over files, whatever. So I think definitely that the PR or whatever you have, the fork, the branch, the place where you develop should have an open PR. and have some place where we could check out different ideas, prototype, test, try to find some common ways to simplify and to help out. But I'm not sure whether it actually will get merged before 1.10 if we prioritize stabilization and going to GA. Because it seems like most of the things you can do with kubeadm today, or am I wrong?
But in part it is true, because the prototype wrap up everything it is already in the code base. So it doesn't address things like, I don't know, creating a load balancer or the etcd operator. So partially you are right, and I agree with you that we should work on these according to priority, by the way. But there is some differences that doing this prototype, I discovered some weakness in the current API definition for kubeadmin, or some weakness in the current process of doing kubeadmin init in the second master. You can create some problem for the next updates and so on and so on. So
yeah,
discussion, for me, it is interesting. Then if implement or not in this cycle is another decision.
Yeah, so I mean, why this is really useful is that, and why I think you should have it open as a PR, but I won't promise we'll merge it right away. Why I think it's valuable is that we get to prototype and we get to know the different, how to improve the other parts of the system before going to GA, right? So for example, the API, as we know it, should be redesigned, and we have known that from the beginning, basically. But we're holding it up for component config. That doesn't like we could still do a temporary version, like one that is backwards compatible using the API machinery. So I think fixing, you open this as a PR, have a prototype, which is great. Then you help out on improving the API and the types we have there. That will be great. And you help fix the problems in kubeadm init on the second master, that or corner cases or whatever. So, and those two are already significant amount of work, and they are very valuable. Then, as we tend to try to get too much into our release, as Tim tried to say here before, I won't promise that this UX thing -- master can merge, but we'll see. Seems like we're out of time.
That was also the last thing on the agenda, which is convenient. So we'll see everybody next week. I will put together the 1.10 planning doc, and we can go over that at the beginning of the meeting. Hopefully it won't take the entire meeting. And please add any other agenda items you have, and I'll try to get Walter to show up next week too.
And Justin, I mean, feel free to add COPS things to the SIG planning doc that Robert is creating as well, that touch SIG.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. Bye.